Thor and Utgarda-Loki, part of the Viking Spirit, by Daniel McCoy. While Thor and Loki were traveling far from Asgard in Thor's goat-drawn chariot, night overtook them and they were welcomed into the house of the farmer and his family. To repay his hosts for their hospitality, Thor offered his goats for supper, knowing that he could bring them back to life afterwards and not be at any loss. Just as the meal began, Thor laid the goats' hides on the floor and instructed his hosts to place the bones on the hides after the meat had been cleaned from them. The farmer had 2 children, a boy named Thjalfi and a daughter named Roskva. Despite the thunder god's instructions, Thjalfi broke open one of the goat's leg bones to suck out the marrow before placing it on the hide with the others. Thor awoke early in the morning, before anyone else in the household. He hallowed the goat hides and the bones with his hammer, whereupon the goats sprang back to life. One of them, however, had a lame hind leg. Thor immediately intuited the reason for this, and flew into a rage. The farmer and his family awoke abruptly to Thor's howls and crashes. The thunder god would have slain them all on the spot had the farmer not offered him his children, Thjalfi and Roskva, to be his servants. Thor accepted, and he, Loki, and the children pressed onward on foot, since the goats were in no shape to pull a chariot. The party's destination was Jotunheim. On the way, they crossed an ocean and a thick, tangled forest. Just as the night was falling, they came to a huge hall. They found no one inside and decided to spend the night there. In the middle of the night, they were jostled awake by a great earthquake. Running outside, they found a sleeping giant whose snores caused the earth to rumble and shake. Thor clutched his hammer and resolved to smite this sure foe of his. But the giant awoke at the last second and seemed to be cheered, or at least amused, by the sight of Thor and his companions. The giant introduced himself as Skirmir, boaster, but said that he already knew the identity of those to whom he was speaking. Skirmir picked up his glove, the great hall in which Thor and his company had slept during the night, and proposed that he accompany them on their journey. Despite their apprehension, they agreed in the interest of having a native guide, and off they went through dark forests and over steep hills. At night, they took shelter beneath a mighty ancient oak. Skirmir had been carrying all of their provisions in his bag, and when the giant fell asleep, the task of opening the bag fell to Thor. But the god found himself unable to untie the giant's knots. This so angered him that he struck the dozing Skirmir on the forehead, hoping to kill him. But the giant awoke calmly and asked if the leaf had fallen on his head. Later in the night, the giant's snores grew so loud that they echoed through the valleys like thunder. Thor, annoyed by his inability to sleep, and still looking for any excuse to kill the giant, tried a second time to smite him by striking him on the head. But, much as before, Skirmir awoke and asked if an acorn had fallen on his head. Just before dawn, Thor decided to try one more time to end Skirmir's life. But when the giant woke, he asked if some birds had roosted above him and shaken some dirt from the branches onto his face. Skirmir departed from Thor and his companions, and the company pressed onwards toward a castle called Utgard. Around midday, the travelers reached their destination. The gate was locked and no one was there to open it, but Thor and the others found that they could fit through the very large spaces between the bars of the gate easily enough. Once inside, they found a hall where men sat eating and drinking. Amongst them was the king of this castle, the giant Utgarda-Loki, who immediately recognized his new guests and set about taunting them for how small they were in comparison to himself and his people. Wanting to salvage his dignity and that of his companions, Loki proudly asserted that no one else in this castle could eat food faster than he could. Utgarda-Loki challenged him to prove this boast by entering a contest with one of the men there, who was called Logi, fire. A trough of meat was set before them, and Loki at one end and Logi at the other, and they were to see who could reach the middle first. They met in the middle at the same time, but while Loki had eaten all the meat between the end and the middle, Logi had eaten the meat, the bones, and even the trough itself. Loki had clearly lost. Thjalfi, who was a famously swift runner, then offered to race anyone in the castle. Utgarda-Loki led him out to a huge track and appointed one Hugi, thought, to compete with him. By the time Hugi reached the finish line, he was so far ahead of Thjalfi that he doubled back to meet his opponent. They raced a second time, and once again Hugi beat Thjalfi by a long bowshot. Still, they raced a third time, but Thjalfi fared even worse. He was still at the midpoint of the track by the time Hugi finished. Thor then challenged anyone in the castle to a drinking contest, something at which he had no little skill. Utgarda-Loki had one of his servants fetch the kind of drinking horn from which Utgarda-Loki's men were said to drink. When it was placed before Thor, Utgarda-Loki informed him that whoever should finish the horn in one drink was considered a great drinker. Whoever could do it in two was considered fair, but no one in his retinue was such a poor drinker as to be unable to finish it in 3. Thor drank mightily, but by the time he had to pause for breath, the level of liquor in the horn had barely lowered. So he gave it a second try, straining to gulp and gulp until his breath failed him. This time, the level had gone down appreciably, but the better part of the horn still remained. His third drink was even more formidable than the previous 2, but in the end, much was still left. By that point, however, Thor could drink no more, and gave up. Then Utgarda-Loki suggested that Thor attempted to simply lift his cat from the floor, but Thor proved unable to do even this. In a rage, Thor challenged anyone in the castle to wrestle with him. Insultingly, Utgarda-Loki appointed an old woman, Elli, age, who was one of his servants. But the great god lost even this contest. After this, Utgarda-Loki decided that there would be no more contests, and that the company spent the night there in the castle. In the morning they rose and prepared to leave. After Utgarda-Loki had shown them out of the castle, he confided to them that he had actually transpired in their contests, saying to Thor, "Now that you have left my castle, I shall see to it that you never enter it again. The knot on my provision bag, that you almost succeeded in untying, had been wrought in iron. I used magic to deflect the blows you attempted to inflict on me with your hammer. Instead of my face, you hit the mountainside, and carved 3 gaping valleys into it. Had you struck me, I would have been killed then and there." He continued. Loki held his own remarkably well in the eating contest, since his opponent was none other than fire itself. So it was with Thjalfi, too. He raced against thought, which no one could ever hope to outrun. The far end of the horn from which you drank was connected to the sea, and we were actually greatly afraid you were going to drink at all. When you cross over the sea again, you will see how much you have lowered its level. My cat was actually the Midgard serpent, whom you succeeded in raising out of the ocean and into the sky. And finally, you wrestled against old age, and took a long, long time to fall. Now, for your sake and for ours, leave, and never come back." Thor was so angered by this humiliating trickery that he raised his hammer and prepared to slay Utgarda-Loki and smash his castle to pieces. But when he turned to do so, he saw no giant and no castle, just a vast, empty plain.